Welcome to this session. So we are in the topic of constructors, and with this, I'd like us to start by reviewing what was covered in a previous session. Previously, had walked us through such an example when we were discussing class members. I will make a point of attaching the card for that session in the video. So class database was the class, and we looked at the default constructor for class database, which is the public database, parentheses and curly braces. So let me just go back to the database class that we have previously, and I'll show us the constructors. If you missed that session, there is a link in the description with the code that I'll be walking us through. And there's also a link with the finished code for this session. So the class database has this constructor. This is the default constructor. It's the one that I am going to use to walk us through the examples on the whiteboard. But we also have this other constructor here from a previous session. So switching back to talk more about that. There was a diagram with these icons earlier on. Let's build on that. So blueprint or a class has a constructor within it. For example, class database has constructor by the same name within it. And what happens is either the main method or any method gets to invoke that constructor. And when they do that, then they create objects from that class and that blueprint by invoking the constructor of the said class and the said blueprint. So let me go back to the IDE and show us this object creation. Where did this happen? Although we saw it in a previous session, it was in the main class and within the main method. So we have this right here where we got to see how we can create an object from a constructor. So let's walk through that and unpack it, because previously we just looked at it, but now let's unpack what's going on. From the top, the class database, the constructor has the same name as the class name. So same name as the class, and also it doesn't have a return type. So when you're starting out, you might confuse this declaration with that of the method, because it's the one we looked at in the previous session. So the declaration of the method had a return type that is either string, int. I think in the example in the session, I showed us int example and void example. I can actually just navigate there. In defining methods, I believe. Let me just check that. Yes. So this was the class where we saw this is a method. This is the data type int, but also it could if it doesn't have data type, it needs to have void, because data type is required in the declaration. So the constructor looks similar, only that it has the same name as the class and it doesn't have a return type, unlike methods. So in the main method of the main class, when you're creating an object from a constructor, you work with the new operator and you call the constructor using that new operator. So what will happen then with the combination of new and the call to the constructor, it creates a memory space for the object that you're creating, and it also initializes the object field. And in this case, our field is Oracle. You can call it variable too, and you'll see it being referred to as a variable. It depends on the official documentation you're working with. So the whole thing, what it does, that is from left to right, or rather from right to left, whichever way. Database Oracle equals to new, or rather it's initialized to new database, call to the constructor. What we say it does in Java is it invokes the no argument constructor to create a new database object called Oracle. So if you're telling a story about what this code is doing, that's likely how you have to put it. All right. Now, let's unpack the constructor declaration we've already identified. It's very similar to the method declaration. So public modifier is private. It's optional. Not really that. It is optional. If you would need to invoke this constructor from a different class, you need to make it public. Okay, so that's an access modifier. We'll talk more about access modifiers later. Secondly, it's the name of the class. Third, the parameters or the parentheses and its parentheses, then the curly braces. So again, it's similar to the method declaration, only that it does not have a return type as a method would. When we were declaring methods, we saw how it could get complicated. So it also doesn't have the complications, maybe with the exceptions, and we also saw that in class declaration, where sometimes it would get complicated with extending and implementing keywords, but we'll talk more about that in a future session. So note that this is the declaration for the constructor. Now, about the signature, so the methods have signatures, and so do constructors. That is what the compiler uses to tell them apart. So we have database, the parentheses and its parameters if applicable, and the curly braces. This one right here is the method signature. No, the curly braces don't count. Sorry, let me just erase that. When you talk about the signature, just keep it like that. Keep it simple. That is what the compiler will use to tell them apart. So I will walk us through this again, because we'd already seen earlier on when going through methods, the signature of the methods. I showed us how you cannot have the method by the same parameter arguments types and the same number. So you can have the same name. We called that overloading within the method's end. So let's see what happens, or what kind of compile time errors we'd get if you attempt to have the same signature for constructors. So I'll switch to database class. We already have this constructor here. If I attempt to use the same signature, note that I am leaving behind the word, the public modifier. If I attempt to do that, it will error out. This is a compile time error, and the error, obviously, as I expect, is for it to let me know that there is already a compiler, but a constructor by the same name. So it cannot happen in the same class again, and it's just letting me know there is a problem that has arisen from that. Okay, so the signature has to be unique for a constructor, as we saw in methods. If I was to make this same signature again, let's work with a constructor that has more than one, that has parameters. If I was to do that, it will also error out. Okay, so the thing is, these parameters cannot be of the same type, data type, and they cannot be of the same amount. So if I was to add another one, let's say int x here, then the error is corrected. Why? Because this signature is different, given that it has 4 parameters or 4 arguments, and this one has 3. So take note of that. The number of the parameters that is sorted and the type. So let me show us the type. I'll just delete that. If I was to have a different data type here, int, for example, it corrects the error. So the definition, or rather the signature of the methods and constructors, because it's the same, they need to have the name. If the name is the same, they need to have the different type of parameters, and or rather different numbers. So something that the compiler will use to set them apart. Same applies to methods, again, which we had seen earlier. So definitely I cannot have void disconnect without the parameters, because there's already an existing method as such. And similarly, if I was to have another method, void connect, for example, with the same type and number of parameters, I'll expect to see an error. Again, if I change the type, that fixes it. Compile time errors from similar signatures of methods and constructors. Although on this one, we're talking about constructors. Okay. Finally, more notes on constructors. So the compiler automatically provides the no argument or the default constructor. We've seen this in the previous session, but let me just walk us through that again. When I was starting this with the database class, I didn't have this custom constructor. So I didn't need then to include this constructor here. It's in a previous session. So I could still work with this. I could still create new objects using a default constructor, because even though I don't have a constructor in my database class, there is a default one that's provided by default for us to use. Now, we need to understand some few things about that in the Java concepts. Default constructor calls the no argument constructor of the class's superclass. A superclass is a class that is extended, or rather it's inherited from. We'll talk more about this in inheritance. So you would get compile time error if a superclass lacks a default constructor and you have not included your own constructor in the child class. So let me just demonstrate that using what we already had. So this is Oracle. There is the problem already. This is Oracle. It is extending database. Okay. I had that default constructor. So let me just do this. Let me just comment this here so I can demonstrate. So we have this class Oracle extending the class database. This is inheritance. Again, we'll talk more about this. I had created this earlier to show us an example of how sometimes you might prefer to just have another database extending from the superclass database or parent class database. So if I have this class here, Oracle, and it's extending class database, and I come to database here and I remove the default constructor. So let me just remove this constructor here. I'll comment it out just in case I need to bring it back. So we have class Oracle that is extending database, i.e. it's inheriting from database. If I was to go to database and remove the constructors, the public default constructor, then I will see a problem on Oracle. And what it will let me know is it cannot apply the default constructor. So I would either create my own, or I would need to create one that is similar to the constructor that is available in this class. So what has happened here? This class only has a custom constructor. If I create a subclass of that class without including the default constructor, because maybe I have read very briefly about the rules and I learned somewhere that the default constructor is automatically created for me. If I see this problem, it could throw me off. Please don't get thrown off. What it is telling you is the superclass here does not have a default, or rather a no argument constructor. And as such, this class, it's not possible for it to have an automatic no argument constructor. There is a problem there. So take note of that. So I'll just comment this back so to remove the error, and that should work. So if I have a default no argument constructor in the superclass, then that in that class, I won't need to create the no argument constructor because it will take from the superclass. That is the point here. A default constructor calls the no argument constructor of the superclass. So if that superclass does not have a default constructor, like in the example I've just shown you, then it will error out. So for classes that don't have an explicit parent, a class like database class, for example, in Java, every class has an implicit parent called object. And lucky for us, in the Java side, object has a no argument constructor. So in that case, a no argument constructor is automatically created in such classes. Like when you're starting out with database class, we didn't need to create a no argument constructor. Even right now, if I was to make this class without a direct explicit superclass, I'll still see no errors because it is now, object is now the superclass, the implicit superclass. And as such, there are no errors here because object does have a no argument constructor. So We will talk more about this when we discuss inheritance. Okay, so take note of that. Yes, we do know a no argument constructor is created for us by default. Okay, but that could cause compile time errors if the direct superclass for that class does not have a no argument constructor. All right, so see you on the next one.